I want to sew a ballet leotard for my daughter's photo shoot, but make it couture as much as I can. Which can be a little bit of a challenge because I'm working with mostly 4-way stretch fabric, and because I do not have a serger, also 4-way stretch fabrics typically are synthetic. I can't even find a silk blend in that material. After the pins were carefully removed, the outline bodice panels and the back and front bottom portion of the existing leotard that fit my daughter beautifully were traced onto the paper to create a sewn pattern. This helped me construct the first and only mock-up. I bought this beautiful silk velvet. This is pretty much 100% silk, or maybe like 95% silk. It's absolutely beautiful, and I'm going to have to be very careful with it, especially when it comes to steaming and pressing. I've also bought 4-way stretch rayon-blend. This is where couture is going out the window because I can't find stretch silk for the life of me. 4-way stretch silk. But I really like this because it's thick. I probably won't need to line it. But what I will have to do is I will have to dye the fabric so that it matches this over here. So based on the only mock-up sewn, I needed to remove 5/8 of an inch from the two front panels for a better fit, add about 1/2 inch to the neckline for better coverage, and combine the two side panels into one to help remove busyness and any additional seam lines. I really wanted this leotard to be clean. The front velvet bodice needs to be underlined to provide a bit more structure and to help during the actual sewing. Velvet shifts a lot when handled, and silk organza is amazing for stability. I have a lot of that fabric left from when I was sewing my sister's wedding gown, so I was super happy that it's still useful. Apparently you never want to press the velvet directly with an iron. The fabric has pile, and if heat is applied, it will change color, flatten out, and lose the luminous surface. I'm using my silk organza pressing cloth as a protective layer and seaming the fabric without touching it directly to help remove wrinkles. There is such a thing as a needle board, which allows direct iron pressing and prevents the crushing of the pile, but those things are expensive, and no, not yet, maybe later. When thread tracing the bodice, you never want to directly mark the fashion fabric with chalk, even if it's on the back side. Thread does not magically disappear like chalk, and so there will always be a clear guide on where to attach the seams and notches. I have secured each pattern piece with pins directly into the silk organza, making sure that on every panel the waistline is exactly on straight of grain. Cut out the organza panels with generous seam allowance and place the layers onto the back side of the velvet. Simply use pins to secure the inside of the seam lines, and you will always know where the true grain line is. I felt it was helpful to steam the fabric as I went. Also, very important to note that the panels need to be placed all in one direction. Velvet has a distinct nap and will look like a different color if the panel is placed in the opposite direction. When the underline and the fashion fabric of the panels are thread traced together and then cut out, don't forget to machine baste the neckline. Don't even breathe on the panels if this is not done, because the neckline will definitely distort. I then hand basted the center front panels together with running stitches that are about 3/8 of an inch in length. I found that this worked a lot better than pins alone because velvet does not want to stay in place. Almost fluid-like, even with the silk organza underlining. carefully seam the center front seam lines open. Do not touch the fabric with an iron, unless you have one of those ironing boards. Next, before moving on to the next panels, I've added a boning channel. Only the two center front panels required a twill tape because seam allowances alone cannot be used to create a channel since this fabric is pressed open. To keep things as neat as possible, I placed the twill tape exactly on center, made a basting stitch in the middle, and then two more temporary stitch lines on either side, creating a channel approximately 3 millimeters wider than the spiral boning. This will help keep the tape in place as it is attached to the zigzag stitch on both sides. Nothing but a zigzag stitch worked in my situation, probably due to the materials used. Also, excuse the wonkiness of the center seam. I will definitely remedy this horrible situation. Time to move on to the next two adjacent panels. Hand-based per usual, and do not rush the process. In my case at least, work turns out to be so much neater if I take my time. And so here's when I realized that the layers on the seam of the silk velvet I'm using prefer to be pressed to one side rather than opened. If you can tell, the work on the left is so much cleaner and straighter. So I just continued on with this approach, and rather than sewing a twill tape on the top of the seam lines that connects the two panels together, I moved about 9 millimeters away from the seam line and sewn a parallel stitch line through all 4 layers of the seam allowances. Using my husband's dubious tools, I hit the sharp ends of the spiral bone with the boning tip. If done properly, by pressing on all 4 sides simultaneously, it should lock it in place. See? The bone should be about 1/8 of an inch shorter at both the top and the bottom of the channel. The bone should also fit the channel tightly, but not so tightly that ripples are created or too loose where its existence defeats its purpose. Spiral bones are still the industry standard in couture, and from my experience are the best quality-wise and bendability. Not that I worked with plastic much. I'm adding this beautiful cotton lace not only as an accent piece, but also to add texture to the outfit and disguise the wonky seam line. I often forget what I have hidden away in my sewing room, so finding this was a lovely surprise. I will be dyeing it along with the fashion fabric so that... Or maybe I should just leave it as it is for contrast. No, it needs to be monochromatic, so it'll happen. The dye will happen. With the spiral bone in place, the seam allowances are carefully graded to reduce bulk, and each layer is then secured to the underlining with the neat herringbone stitch. When possible, I use pinking shears on the seams and then carefully create a small stitch line about 1/8 of an inch from the edge to help prevent the fabric from unraveling. On to dyeing the actual fabric, which was quite an experience. I followed the direction on the box and dyed a few samples first to make sure that I can actually achieve the color that I need, which I did, but it took a few tries. About 3 days and boxes of dye. Yes, the process wasn't correct, I know. I should have just made a huge dye bath, tested a tiny sample so that it does not soak up all the dye, made the necessary adjustments to the pigments, and then placed the fashion fabric into the dye bath when satisfied with the color. That would have saved me time. Once the not so pleasant part was behind me, I could carefully sew in the beautiful trim with invisible stitching, which was also dyed to match the velvet. The seam allowances along the neckline could finally be folded along the stitching and secured to the underlining with herringbone. I've kept the length of the seam allowances intentionally long so that alterations can be easily made in the future. This is very helpful and is generally done so in couture houses because clients often return asking for adjustments. I've realized that working with velvet is not so bad. Even stitching in areas where there's not a lot of fabric to work with was a smooth process. Maybe it's because most of it was done by hand. The lining is silk charmeuse. When it comes to slippery fabric, never bypass tissue paper. It works as a wonderful stabilizer and is satisfying to remove afterwards. You want to press open the seam allowances to reduce bulk and finish the edges with pinking shears and a straight stitch. I've ordered strap elastic from Bodice Bespoke and the color came out to be pretty much on point. Using a tiny Fallon stitch to secure the strap to the bodice without thread showing on the front. Hopefully this will last a while. The lining needs to be a bit larger than the actual front bodice to help prevent it from distorting the shape of the garment, because if it's too tight, not only could it feel uncomfortable, but also pull the corseted front top in weird ways and ruin the entire fit. Hand sewing the slippery lining onto the bodice allows for so much control and distribution of the fabric, even if some panels are a bit off. And even though this was a bit of a long process, it would have taken me 10 times longer by machine because knowing myself, the seams would never align perfectly from the start. Alright, onto the dreadful stretchy material. So I was able to get the color I envisioned in my head, but then I began second guessing myself and thinking that this darker, less yellow-green might work as well. However, I would need to add this darker green trim to the bodice so that the darker leotard material could feel cohesive. Anyways, just throwing my sidetracking out there because I eventually scrapped this idea since the busyness of the additional trimming would make it look a lot more homemade than high fashion. This is my second time sewing with stretchy fabric. The first one was the mock-up. Thread marking was not an option because the needle did not want to go through smoothly and would shift the fabric as I attempted. So even though there's a chance the chalk would disappear, this was my only option. To be safe, I made the seam allowance 5/8 of an inch, cut it all out, and made an additional underlining for the front. Probably not very necessary because the fabric is heavy as it is, but here we are. Attaching the two layers of the front lower portion of the leotard so that it could be treated as one, and then basting the piece to the waistline of the bodice by hand. There needs to be as much control as possible, especially because I'm not really sure what I'm doing. Also, when the waistline is attached, it should be sewn from one side panel toward the center front on one side and then on the other. This helps the fabric lay correctly, grading the seams per usual, especially because there's a lot of bulk. fall right onto the back. This piece is definitely constructed from basic observation and what made sense to me. And because I did not have an overlock, a zigzag stitch is used to attach the elastic along the scoop back, stretching the elastic as I go so that it serves its purpose. Then the seam allowance is folded to the back and a top stitch is sewn along the edge, after which a second parallel row. Make sure to stitch through the elastic in both rows, otherwise the thread will snap. I've learned it the hard way. I then attached the seams of the front and the back with just a regular straight stitch and added a zigzag stitch for security. Again, no overlock here. This part was sewn together by stitching only the 2 layers. Meanwhile, the underlining is then folded back and secured in place when the edge of the leg line is finished on both sides. I've used the same approach to secure the elastic and finish the edge on the leg line as I have on the back scoop, but I don't want to talk about it because I don't like to work with 4-way stretch fabric. Because of the structural element of the leotard, the strap's elastic felt like it needed more weight, so I folded back the extra bit and secured the 2 layers together. The silk bodice of the lining can finally be secured all around and the leotard is complete. Well, almost. I've eventually adjusted the placement of the straps because they were stitched far too close to the center back. It did not look good on the body, and also made the straps adjustable because they felt more functional this way. Now it's complete. Thank you for watching.